Hello and welcome, those of you who have already arrived. Thanks for joining us. This is Brad Davidowitz from VIP. We're going to wait a few more minutes before we get started, but we will be starting pretty close to the top of the hour. Thanks so much. Well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining. We have a lot to cover today, so we're going to get started just as quickly as we can. My name is Brad Davidowitz. I run operations and delivery for the professional services at Visionary Integration Professionals, aka VIP. This is the first in a series of 3 sessions focused on Agile and DevOps transformations powered by SmartBear Software. Today we're going to focus on planning and design activities. Session 2 will cover details related to testing and test automation. Session 3 will cover CI/CD integration and reporting. But before we get into the heart of our content, there will be a brief introduction by Jeff Betcher, Chief Business Development Officer at VIP, and also a brief overview by SmartBear Sales Manager Nick DeFelice pertaining to the SmartBear tools that are going to be highlighted in the presentation. We will then turn things over to VIP Solution Architect David Alves, who will cover the bulk of the materials and initiate the actual demonstration. We do have a lot of materials to cover, as I mentioned, and expect that the session will run for the full 60 minutes. If you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat session, and we will attempt to cover them as much as possible. And before you ask, the session will be recorded and available for playback. With that said, over to you, Jeff.
Great, Brad. Thanks for the intro there, and welcome everybody. We appreciate you guys spending the next hour with us today to go over some of this information. VIP, as Brad mentioned as we go by, is a solutions consulting firm, and we specialize really in the 4 areas you see in front of you: management consulting, software quality management, organizational development, and DevOps. Our relationship with SmartBear as a service implementer for their tools, really today and throughout this webinar series will focus around the software quality management platform as well as DevOps and how we go about integrating and make customers successful with that. Next slide for me quick, Dave. So if looking at this and talking about how we actually help our customers be successful, you can see a list of the different items that we offer in our services implementation services portfolio. It includes everything from helping customers with pre-sales and implementation services when they actually acquire SmartBear software, as well as software quality management assessments, coaching, tool implementations. So I'm really going throughout and just helping them, whether it's with staffing or incremental consulting efforts to really make them successful with these solutions. So, as more of our customers work to shift left and work to integrate their testing with DevOps, we feel like we have a really nice portfolio of services and a fabulous team to help with the integrations here. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nick DeFelice here to talk a little bit about the SmartBear portfolio.
Jeff, thank you so much. And I'll again give a quick overview to SmartBear and the product portfolio, and of course what we're going to focus in on today. So this is the entire SmartBear stack today. So from left to right, we have tools that support design, commit, test, deploy, and monitor. Again, we're going to focus today on really the left-hand side of the screen on the design phase on 3 key tools: SwaggerHub, CucumberStudio, Cucumber Jira, as well as Zephyr, which you'll see in the upper left-hand corner there under test management. So another way to look at this with maybe a little cleaner view, right, is these 4 buckets: design, create, test, and monitor. I skipped deploy because SmartBear doesn't offer anything in that space, but we are going to partner with some of the biggest players there. I'm sure you recognize all of those logos, and many of you are likely using tools in that stack today. But we're going to focus on the left-hand side of the screen with those design tools. Again, CucumberStudio, Cucumber for Jira, SwaggerHub, and Zephyr. And the takeaways for those 3 tools, Dave, as we move to the next slide, would be for SwaggerHub. Again, it's an API design and documentation tool. So for designing, documenting, and developing your APIs in one collaborative platform all around the open API specification. For CucumberStudio and Cucumber for Jira, those are collaborative BDD platforms. Design feature and test cases in one interface with native behavior-driven development, or BDD, support for ultimate collaboration. And finally, with Zephyr, one of the newer SmartBear tools to our lineup. It's a test management platform built for both enterprise and Atlassian-based customers. So I'm going to hand things back to Solution Architect David Alves. David, all yours.
All right, thank you, Nick. Today and over the course of this webinar, we're going to look at a real-life mock DevOps sprint scenario involving 2 sprint teams. You can't say you're truly practicing DevOps unless you follow at least these minimum requirements, right? You've got automated deployments, automated testing, and collaboration throughout the SDLC. In a typical DevOps life cycle, you have a number of sprint teams comprised of developers, QA engineers, business analysts, project and program managers, and potentially a customer or end user representative, as well as sporadic involvement of both release management and IT deployment personnel. Today, we're going to focus on this side of the SDLC, the sprint cycles, and the rest of our webinar series, we will focus on other aspects of the rest of the SDLC, but in particular today, we're going to focus on specification by example. Specification by example is a process of collaboration used in behavior-driven development, or BDD. Typically, program managers and project managers, as well as business analysts, come together and focus on defining the project requirements, and they add them to what they call stories or features into Jira, into a backlog to be pulled forward in each successive sprint for implementation. After that happens, once the sprint gets started, we have usually the business analysts and the QA engineers, or a small part of the Scrum team, focused on creating initial base or key examples. Examples that define or demonstrate that the product or that the feature or capability story is complete. Those are then refined by the entire sprint team in a process known as specification with examples to come up with the ultimate definition of done for any particular story or sprint. We're going to be looking at defining those key examples today with Cucumber for Jira, and then having the entire Scrum team work together to refine the definition of done using CucumberStudio. In addition, since today is focused on planning, we're going to take an initial look at the QA team at the beginning of the sprint using a test management tool such as Zephyr Enterprise, as well as the dev team using SwaggerHub to define the API. So for today's mock scenario, the system under test is a website called heatclinic.com. It's for selling hot sauces, where company XYZ is going to be migrating the API from OpenAPI 2.0 to OpenAPI 3.0. It's a three-tiered architecture where we're going to have a blue sprint team focused on making modifications to the API calls underlying the GUI portion of the application in accordance to what the green team is doing and making the migration from OpenAPI 2.0 to an OpenAPI 3.0 specification, as well as a few modifications. All right, with that, we're going to move on to the demonstration. It was quite involved to get through all these tools, so it is recorded. I want to just make a quick note that as we kick it off, your audio may revert to your operating system default. So for those of you using headsets, you may need to re-engage your headset. And with that, let's get to the video. Here is our application under test, the Heat Clinic web application. It's a standard web application. You can buy hot sauces and other related apparel at this site. A user would start by logging in. They could then come down, look at the hot sauces that they choose to purchase, add it to their cart. They could remove from their cart. They could shop for apparel. And of course, they could log out when they're finished. Now remember, in the scenario that we're providing here today, the blue sprint team is focused on changing the underlying code to this GUI you see in front of you to support the new Heat Clinic OpenAPI 3.0 API specification. The green team is focused on building out that OpenAPI 3.0 API specification and implementing it. Okay, imagine it is the first day of sprint planning. Both the blue and the green sprint teams will be participating in planning, of course. We're going to use Jira software, the #1 agile planning tool in the marketplace. So let's get it started. Okay, for those of you who are familiar with Jira, this is the backlog board. You can see here we have a number of things in our backlog that we can pull into the current sprint, which here is sprint 1. As you might recall from the presentation we did a little while ago, Cucumber for Jira and CucumberStudio can be utilized for key examples, specification with examples, and live documentation. Key examples are typically created by a smaller set of team members in a sprint team to create the key or initial set of examples to share with the rest of the team. For instance, it might be done by the QA personnel, QA engineers, and the business analyst to start out. It's to give a starting point for which the rest of the team can collaborate. Let's look at specifying some key examples with Cucumber for Jira. The way you do this is once you've enabled Cucumber for Jira, you'll have this create a BDD feature here, as well as live documentation, which we'll look at in a moment. When you click on this, it spawns a new issue or story, very much the same as a normal Jira issue. The only major difference is this label here, BDD feature. This instructs Cucumber for Jira to treat this differently and add in the Cucumber for Jira capabilities. So let's start by specifying a brand new story. Okay, we're going to create a new story for the green sprint team's API transformation or migration from OpenAPI 2.0 to 3.0. We're going to link it to the demo epic number 1, and we're going to link it to the first sprint and hit the create button. Okay, so let's go edit this and see what it looks like. All right, we have our title, we have our description with our acceptance criteria. It looks like any old Jira story. However, if we click here, we see Cucumber. And when we do that, we get this additional field here, which when we click allows us to add in Gherkin. So if we click on the Create a Feature File button, we get a template here for some Gherkin. And we can simply paste in our own data. Now, there's no need to save, it'll be automatically saved. But what's interesting here is we're using something called a scenario outline. A little different than a normal scenario. A scenario outline allows you to create an example table, which allows you to specify variable data to be used for this particular scenario. And you can have multiple rows. Here we only have one row, but if we had different data, here you can see the data heat clinic URL is tied to this right here using a special syntax with the greater than less than signs around it, as well as the quotes. And this allows us to specify multiple iterations that we want run with this particular scenario with different data. All right. And that's really it. You have your first Cucumber for Jira scenario. Now, you can also download this Gherkin in a file, which might be helpful to use in CucumberStudio. So we're going to do that as well and use that in coming up. From here, we're going to go look at living documentation. Actually, before we do that, let's look at a fully baked Cucumber for Jira scenario, if you will. Okay, let's take a look at a, as I said, fully baked or complete Cucumber for Jira story here in with the Heat Clinic complete purchase transaction. We'll open this on up. And we see the usual format where the business analyst has put in the acceptance criteria. We scroll down, and in the Cucumber section, we see multiple scenarios. In fact, scenario outlines with example tables. They each only have one row. They have a number of variables, including credentials for logging in. Some of the same sentences are being used across scenarios. They only need to be automated or implemented once. One thing you'll notice up here at the top is revert content. Now we're using Bitbucket here as our Git repository. And what this is saying is that what we see here isn't matching what's checked into source code control. And this is a big issue with doing BDD. You want a single source of truth, right? And what's checked into source code control is probably what's going to be run in the nightly build. Theoretically, should really be this single source of truth, right? You're maintaining versions of this thing in source code control. But when they're in the old days, when you had your Gherkin detached before Cucumber for Jira, your Jira would get out of sync and nobody would ever have the time to keep things in sync. Here, that's completely possible because once it's checked in, there's the living documentation that will show in a minute down here, which is pulled from um, the source code control, and it's actually compared to what's in Jira here. And you can actually click this when there's a difference. That only shows if there's a difference, and you get a window whereby you can compare these things. Now, what I did is I made things align when it comes to the example tables versus over here you can see what's in source code control doesn't actually line up, these slashes. That's really the only difference. And you can revert back to what's in source code control. Or you could do a download and check in the newer version, etc. The idea is not to make it bi-directional, but to have a single source of truth that people can count on. In addition, if we scroll down a bit further, we actually see a link here to the living documentation, which has a link to bring us to the living documentation, which would be the same as going here and navigating to this particular feature, but also some test status. In this case, we have two scenarios. You're able to integrate your CI/CD with the living documentation and upload test results, which we'll look at in a minute. And when you run those tests, the results for each scenario, pass or fail, will be shown here. If both are pass, you'll have a pass here. If one fails, you'll have a fail. And that kind of gives you an idea of what's going on. So I'm going to actually show you one more thing, but then we're going to go look at the living documentation. Over here, you notice a link for CucumberStudio. Okay. If you think about what we just did here, we talked about key examples or the initial or base examples or scenarios created by a small group of people, typically the business analysts and the QA people working together, adding them in here. But then we had specification with examples, which is where the entire sprint team collaborates. And that way you get input from development people, QA people, project managers, business analysts, anybody who happens to be in the sprint planning meetings. And this can be linked up here as well. If you actually click this link, there's nothing actually associated here, but we're going to actually create an association in a little bit and show how this can all be linked up. But before we do that, I want to just touch on that. We're going to go back to the living documentation at the bottom and click this link to take a quick look. All right, so here's the living documentation for this particular feature file and its scenarios. As you can see, this is straight out of source code control. Each scenario shows in its own little panel here, as well as its test status. And this is exactly what is in the Git repository. Now we went right to that specific one because it was this particular feature file because it was linked to that particular story we're on. Had we clicked here, what you get is a higher level, one step up, right? Where we can actually see multiple scenarios. Now you recall a little earlier in the video, we created this Open API 2.0 and Open API 3.0 migration story. If it doesn't actually have a Gherkin scenario or a feature, I'm sorry, you can actually click this plus button and go create it. See, create a Jira issue. If one already exists, you can actually link it up, which we will do right here. And we will select the feature here, and there it is right there, number 18. So we're able to pick that and hit confirm, and now it's linked. So that if you actually want to go back to it, you can just click the link and go back directly to that particular issue. If we go back out to our backlog, however, and jump right back into this particular case, we can then go look at CucumberStudio. Now remember, this is our base or key initial scenario, which we elaborated upon and collaborated on by the entire team. Some might be added, some might be removed, sometimes just the language will be changed. All right, if we click this, it says you can look at a demo video. You can actually click here and log in, or you can refresh after logging in. So let's do this. This allows us to come into CucumberStudio. We have a number of different projects here. They are organized by organization. We can pick the VIP organization. And here's the HIT clinic scenario. Now, when we come in here, we can actually see that we have the complete purchase transaction and the OA 2.0 to 3.0 migration with the various scenarios listed here. If we go into one of these, we can actually see the two scenarios for that particular feature. And if, for instance, we click on this one, you can actually see the Gherkin, and everybody will have an account and be able to log into here, as well as upload attachments and share comments. Before we get into that, however, let's actually link this particular scenario by taking this URL, coming back here, pasting it in there, and clicking the link button. Now, once we've done that, we actually have a link here that links that particular Cucumber for Studio scenario to this particular story. And again, you can click this and go right to it. In addition, you've got the link here, which allows you to click that and jump right back. So lots of options to go back and forth, but as you can see, everything is tightly linked, and from here, we'll go back to CucumberStudio and we'll show you the benefits and power of using CucumberStudio to foster your specification with examples and collaboration across your sprint teams. Okay, so let's look at the benefits of using CucumberStudio. Remember, this is where entire sprint teams, blue or green, are going to come to collaborate with their peers while planning and specifying what they actually want the definition of done to be for the stories they've chosen within this particular sprint. One of the beauties of CucumberStudio is, well, let me show you. We're going to create a brand new scenario. Here you can see we have one scenario, which I carried over from Cucumber for Jira. We're going to create a new scenario that says, let's see, get cart information. Okay, we're going to zoom in on that. And we have no test steps yet. So we're going to start writing some Gherkin. Given, oh, well, look at that down at the bottom. So one of the biggest problems is that as you start to create what we call action words, or the rest of the sentence after the given, when or then, different people might say the same thing different ways. And you don't really know, well, what are the library of action words that I have so I can reuse them, especially if there's code already written behind them. You don't want to reinvent the wheel and have your team writing code for something twice, just said two different ways. For instance, if I said a user mocks the provider adequately, that's going to be a whole different sentence that needs to be coded as opposed to the. Um, so it's very important to manage this, and this is one of the things that the biggest benefits I think that CucumberStudio gives you, apart from its overall collaboration, right? So let's say I say, given the user, all right, well, I want to do this one, logs in with these parameters. Now that's already been coded. You can see it said it was used already. Um, I like to make a distinction between what I have for the GUI and what we have for the um, API. All right, so I would want to come in here and change this. I usually put via API. Okay, that way we actually can distinguish. We still speak in the domain language of the business, but we're indicating that, well, this one's different. It's being done by the API. And then we say, for instance, given the user has, and we put variables in quotes, item count items in their cart via API. Actually, since it's another given, we can change this to an and. Okay. All right. When the user, and again, all of these things are showing up here. We can just click them and reuse them. When the user checks how many items is in his cart via API, then the user sees that they have item count items in their cart via API. So there we have a scenario, but you notice we've got these placeholders showing up in gray or where there wasn't a variable because this was reused. We can fill those in. We can actually just come down here, create a data table. All right, so we hit the plus here. This allows us to add different variables. So we'll say username. We'll say password. And we'll say item count. All right. And we can add a new data set. They ask you to put a name. You could say that this is the get cart info via API. And then we can say that the username is some guy and the password is password and the item count is 1. All right, then we can come down here and by putting our cursor there, clicking and doing equals, we can say username. We come here, we say password. Now these, what you put here has to match what's up top in the column headings. And you can tell it puts a little space there. That means it's mapping appropriately. Here, we can actually just put an equals on the front of that. Hit enter, boom, you can see how it kind of converts. And that's how you create a scenario in Gherkin. Now, you might say, well, geez, I'm not so sure that I did this right. Do we want to say the user, a user? Is it a he or a she? And you can simply add a conversation here, right? You can say, team, do we want to say a user, the user, or other when specifying someone taking action? Also, he, she, etc. for consistency. All right, so we can close that. Now, there's a lot more you can do with Cucumber Studio. Certainly, if we look here, you can create a Jira issue from here. You can actually update the results here with test runs as well. That can again be tied to your CI/CD, just like it was with Cucumber for Jira, or it can actually be a manual upload. You can also, if we're up here at this level, and you actually have a feature file that's simply in a you can put comments here as well, of course, but you have a feature file that's in the form of a file. You can click here and you can actually update from that file. If it's already checked into Git, you can pull it in from Git. You can download it or create a Jira issue as well. So there's a lot you can do here in different ways to skin the cat between Cucumber for Jira and CucumberStudio to give you to tailor it to your culture and how you like to do things. Again, we mentioned action words. So these are all your action words. You can search. Well, did somebody already say something with a user? And you go, okay, yeah, well, there it is. We got to fix that. My user. So these are the kinds of things that you can do with this. You can also get various metrics about, different Jira-related scenarios and things of that nature here. You can actually look at results of test runs and pass and fails, and you can drill down into these to get more details about different runs. And here's a real key feature that many like. You can auto-generate test code or stub code using these numerous frameworks. Now we're going to be working with Test Complete, which has a very tight integration and allows you to sync back and forth from CucumberStudio to Test Complete. But if you were using Selenium or some other framework, you have a lot of options here, and using something called the HIP Test Publisher, you can make that bi-directional. There's a lot you can do here, and it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. But we're going to get more into integrating CucumberStudio with our automation in our next webinar when we actually create some automation and start doing some execution. Lastly, we have the living documentation, and you can have a number of repositories. You can see in here that this is very similar to Cucumber for Jira. No matter where you are, you can actually get to your source code. You can look at these different scenarios and features, as well as you should be able to see status of execution and things of that nature as you jump around from one to the other. If your CI/CD is connected. So that's kind of CucumberStudio in a nutshell. Again, the power is to take that next step and invite entire sprint teams to work on flushing out these features and collaborating and saying, geez, did you think about this? Did you think a developer might see something one way versus the QA person seeing it another way? If it's an API, they might say, hey, I can't do that. You didn't give me enough information. I need some other credential, like a token or something like that, that I get by going here or there or making some other call that you didn't put in there. So it's a way to get things solidified and avoid misunderstandings, and then use that as your specification for automation. All right. So now we're going to take a look at Zephyr and how that ties into this. But the real power behind Zephyr will be when we start to fully integrate it with the automation in our next webinar in this series as well. Okay, on to Zephyr. Now, let's imagine it's late on day 1 of the sprint or day 2. We've got maybe even day 3. We've got all of our specification by example complete. We know what our definition of done is for each of our features or capabilities that we're adding during this particular sprint. And now the QA people turn over to organizing and planning their test execution and have that managed by Zephyr Enterprise. So I'm going to log in as a test manager. And immediately brought to the release summary for the current release we're working on, where we have how many different requirements we have, how many actually mapped to automation or to test cases or not, how many test cases we actually have in total, execution progress and defects, etc. You can also see the test cycles and the phases within those test cycles, which you have a lot of flexibility in organizing as you see fit. All right, so the way things are kind of organized is we have requirements. Now, requirements are basically your requirements for testing. You can actually look at you can organize them however you want and look at them from the top level, right? We've got all of our project requirements, and we've got them organized by epic and sprint. You'll notice some of these look very familiar because they're imported from Jira. There's a bidirectional tie to Jira, and these are our requirements for our test cases, the stories and the scenarios within Jira that we just looked at with Cucumber for Jira and CucumberStudio. For this particular release, we can see which of these, maybe all, maybe none, pertain to this particular release. Now, these were imported. You can import whatever you want, one or two at a time. You can also right-click here and set up a complete Jira Zinc, where these are pulled in automatically from Jira all the time, bidirectionally. Here we can see the epics, and we can actually look at the particular requirements for each epic. One thing that's very noticeable is if you click on these, this is the actual Jira story editable right here in place. You can actually click in here, start making changes and whatnot, and it will reflect in Jira. You edit whatever you edit here, it can be edited in Jira, so you don't have to jump back and forth if you need to make updates and changes. Of course, once you have a requirement, you can map it to a particular test case. Okay, before we go look at that particular map test case, let's go look at all the test cases in the test repository first. So we're going to go back to the main list, and we're going to go to the test repository. Now keep in mind, all these hierarchies you see here are customizable, whether it's in the requirements we were just on or here in the test repository. You organize this structure as you see fit. I created some automated tests and some manual tests. Now let's check out the manual test first. When we look at a manual test, what we have is any mapped requirements. Right now there's nothing mapped. We get some test detail here with test steps, where we can actually specify step number 1, expected result, step number 2. We can even specify test data for each test, and we can also actually tie it to an automated script. We also get a history of executions and so forth and so on, and who actually did that. All right, quite a bit of information there. For automated tests, it's very similar. So if we go to the order checkout and happy path here, we can see the actual Gherkin description that we had from our story in Jira. We have the same kind of information, though we wouldn't specify any particular steps. That would defeat the purpose because it's automated. And we would check the automated script section and fill out the appropriate information. It would then be automated using an agent called a ZBot that we would install on a lab machine where tests were executed. And that's all specified here in Vortex. We're not going to get into those details. Those are things that we'll cover in the next webinar in this series, where we actually create tests and do execution and tie everything you saw here today together to that automation and the results being posted back into these tools that we've been looking at today. Okay, but this should give you a good idea of what you can do with Zephyr. All right, now you can go into planning. And you have what we call execution cycles, and within those, so this is each sprint, for instance, is a cycle. But here I created regression functionality milestone 1, regression functionality milestone 2. Typically, right, you still need to do your traditional deployment to QA and regression set of whatever complete functionality is done over the course of several sprints in the future. And so that's why you'll see these things actually are scheduled out farther. Here, we're looking at this by month. You can see they're out here in June. Regression milestone 1, both automated and manual test. You can see regression milestone 2 is even further out with details there. And of course, we're doing our sprints. We're only on sprint 1. We had sprint 0, which is typically a configuration and setup sprint. And these right now are all gray because nothing's been executed, but you will get the kind of color-coded stoplight kind of pass-fail kind of thing, indicating what's happened in that particular sprint to give you an idea of what's been going on. And next, we'll get it. There's nothing here for text executions. That's for the actual next webinar in the series, as well as we'll create some defects from problems that we have. And we'll also get into the reporting that can be done with this tool once in our last webinar in the series. Of course, as I mentioned, Vortex is the automation part of Zephyr for Enterprise and tying the ZBots or the agents on the various lab machines back to the test management system. Okay, so that is what the QA team on both the blue and the green sprint teams are doing late on day 1, 2, or 3, somewhere in there at the beginning of the sprint. So let's talk about the green team, the development team. What are they doing? The developers on the green team, that is. Well, let's go to SwaggerHub. We're going to sign in. And here we are at my hub. These are all the APIs that I manage or have access to or that are shared with me either privately, publicly, through the various organizations I belong to. For those who aren't familiar with SwaggerHub, it is a API specification and collaboration platform for the development of web service and microservice APIs. It handles either Swagger OpenAPI 2.0 or OpenAPI 3.0. What we see here is we have my hub, and that's everything I have access to, which includes things owned by VIP, as well as I have a pet store API owned by myself here. APIs can be either private or public, or published or unpublished. Uh, Most all of mine here are, or all of mine are unpublished. I do have one public one here. That means we actually published the Heat Clinic Open API 2.0 API when we finished it. Or we made it public. We haven't published it yet, so it's kind of unofficial. But you get the gist. You have some leeway with who you give access to these APIs and things of that nature. We also have organizations. You can belong to multiple organizations. When we click on the organization, you see that the DAlv's Pet Store API is missing because that's my own private collection in my hub. The VIP owned APIs that are shared with me as a member of the VIP team are listed here. And we'll get into these. We have the Heat Clinic Open API 2.0. We have the Heat Clinic Open API 3.0, which is what we're migrating to. We're migrating from this 2.0 to this 3.0 API. You can also not only have APIs, you can have domains. And domains are kind of reusable components that might be used across numerous APIs in your organization, data structures and parameters and things of that nature that you want to have just simply reused and make sure that people don't reinvent the wheel, so to speak. Let's take a look at the Heat Clinic 3.0 API. All right, so what you see here is that we have navigation over here where we can quickly jump in the editor to a particular API call or endpoint. We also have the editor where we can come in here and edit things specifically. And we have the documentation for what here that is generated for Swagger. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Swagger specification generates automatic documentation, which can be live and lets you try it out, assuming you have a mock server of some sort behind it, which we'll touch upon in a minute. Over here, you have different icons that allow you to say hide the navigation, hide the editor, so you can, and the navigation, so you can see just the doc. You can put the navigation back, of course. There is a visual editor as well that if you go to certain parts, you can edit specific API sections. I think most people, developers are more comfortable though working with the in the text editor. And of course, you can hide the documentation itself or both, and the navigation, which is what I like to do to work on it. One of the things we can see right away is there are a number of errors. This would tell us valid if the specification is valid. And this is more or less what we need to do, right, with a 2.0 to 3.0 upgrade. We got to go change and add in, for instance, the schemas part needs to be added in here. In fact, we're going to do that right now, and we're going to make use of a domain rather than fixing this by adding this in, because there are, as you can see, numerous places that this error is going to exist. Since it's part of the 3.0 specification, we're going to come up with some standard replacements or just an example to show you here and use that to collaborate with other team members. So we're going to replace what you see here with a reference to a component in the domain. So let's go to back out here to the domain. So here are the Heat Clinic APIs, which is a domain, as you can see here by the icon. We're going to open it up. And we're going to navigate over to parameters. Okay. And we're actually going to create a template or a component that can be reused for the customer payment ID. So let's see. We're just going to add it on the bottom here. Okay, so now we've added the customer payment ID parameter as a component. a parameter component with a schema type, which is what the error was complaining about. So we're going to save, and we're going to go back here to the Open API 3.0 version. We're going to click down here on our errors, go to line 125 where the error exists, and we're going to replace all of this with a reference. And now the error is gone. Now we're going to say, well, you know what? It'd be really great if one of my coworkers could actually replace all of these parameters with our standard references. So you can actually leave a comment and say, at Greg, can you please replace all standard parameters with references to the heat clinic component domain, please. All right. So now let's save that. And let's actually log out. We're going to log back in as Greg. And see what Greg sees. So this is what Greg sees. You can see G. Margolin over here. He can see both the components and the OpenAPI 3. When he goes in there to work on that, he will have received an email as well, indicating that a message has been left. And he will see this here. Oh, comments. Okay. And this way you can collaborate as a team and you know, leave notes for each other, work collaboratively. Updates that I made, changes I made here are shown here as well. You know, so the error is gone, right? And we should see the reference there in line 25. So we're able to collaborate, and people can see these messages and leave messages of their own, so forth and so on. Okay, let's take a quick look at what Andrew sees. If we log out and we log back in as Andrew, whose username is acol, he has access to these two things as well. And of course, he can see the comments as well. Everyone can see the comments that everybody's making. But you'll notice something here. It says read only. Andrew is simply a consumer. He can't design or modify or produce the API. He only sees what a consumer sees, which is very interesting. You know, it's a way to control who can change what, etc., and so forth and so on. All right. Well, that kind of concludes our look at SwaggerHub today. I hope you enjoyed it, as well as the entire demo. In our upcoming webinars, we're going to be looking at pulling this all together, integrating SwaggerHub with Ready API, which includes SoapUI Pro, includes LoadUI, and Service V and Vert Server as well, which will fully utilize those tools to integrate with this. As well as Test Complete and some of the other tools that will tie back to the other things you saw in today's webinar. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you. Bye. Okay. At this time, we'd like to open the floor for some Q&A. I know it took some time, but we will take questions. We can stay long for those who can. Brad, did you want to say a few things?
I just wanted to let everyone know that I've unmuted your controls on my end. So if you're still muted, you may need to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. If you would rather send it through the chat message, feel free to do so. But we'll welcome questions while we can. And while we see if there's any questions coming in, a couple of reminders that we do have the session 2 and session 3 coming up that are currently scheduled for roughly 2 weeks apart each, that will get into more of the testing and test automation activities that David was talking about. And then in session 3, more coverage of integration and reporting, along with additional concepts that might help close out and wrap out the session.
For those who can't stay, perhaps you could, if you have questions, you could leave them in the chat as well.
All right, well, if you do have questions and you want to reach out to us, feel free to do so. A general, easy way to get information to us is on that info@trustvip.com email that you see on the screen at the moment. We also will be sending out an email with follow-up information, access to the recorded session, reminders on the future sessions, and we anticipate that we'll be sending you a separate invitation that will give you an ability to add to your calendar the second session if you're interested in joining that as well. Hope to see you there, and thanks again for signing us.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Have a great day.